The billboard loomed over the highway like a sentinel from another time. Most drivers didn't bother to glance up anymore. They knew the story, or rather, the mystery. 20 years. That's how long Amos Blackwell had lived on top of the weathered structure, enduring scorching summers, bone-chilling winters, and countless storms. Why? No one knew. He was a living ghost, anchored to his perch, refusing to speak to anyone who dared to ask why he stayed. But today, something was different. A newcomer to town stopped her car at the base of the towering billboard. She shaded her eyes and gazed upward. For Mia Brooks, a struggling journalist on the verge of losing her job, Amos wasn't just a local oddity. He was a story, a career-saving story, and she was going to unravel his secret. Amos Blackwell, Mia muttered to herself, scrolling through clippings she had gathered at the town library. There were grainy photos of Amos when he first climbed up, his face younger, his shoulders broader. The articles speculated endlessly. Was he mourning a loss, hiding from the law, protecting some dark secret? But the trail always ended the same way, with Amos refusing to come down and refusing to explain. At the town's only diner, Mia stirred her coffee as she eavesdropped on locals. Conversations about Amos were laced with wild theories. "He's punishing himself," one man said, shaking his head. "For what? Nobody knows." "He's got nothing left," added a woman in a faded apron. "That billboard's all he's got now." "Or all he's protecting," Mia said aloud, her voice surprising even herself. A few heads turned, but no one corrected her. By the time she reached the base of the billboard later that afternoon, Mia's curiosity had turned into determination. If she could crack Amos's story, she could save her career, and maybe uncover something extraordinary. The sun was beginning to set as Mia called out to the shadowy figure perched high above. "Amos Blackwell," she shouted. "I'm Mia Brooks, a journalist. I'd like to tell your story." At first there was no response, just the whistle of the wind through the beams. Then, with the slow precision of someone used to being watched, Amos shifted. His silhouette leaned forward, and the brim of his weather-beaten hat tipped just enough for Mia to catch a glimpse of his face, lined, tanned, and unyielding. "There's no story," he rasped, his voice carrying down like gravel on steel. "Go home." Mia didn't budge. "Everyone has a story, Mr. Blackwell, and I think yours is worth telling." For a moment, Amos simply stared at her, the weight of 20 years of silence heavy in his gaze. Then, with a small shake of his head, he leaned back into the shadows, retreating from her questions. Mia wasn't one to give up easily. She set up camp at the base of the billboard, returning every day to ask her questions. At first, Amos ignored her completely, but over time, small cracks began to show in his armor. She noticed his routine, how he would take out a tattered notebook every evening and flip through its pages, his expression softening, as if he were reading words meant only for him. "What's in the notebook?" Mia asked one evening, her voice quieter now, less intrusive. Amos froze. His hand lingered on the cover of the notebook before he clutched it tightly to his chest. "It's not about the notebook," he muttered, his voice carrying the weight of something sacred. "It's about the promise." Mia's curiosity deepened. She began asking the townspeople about Amos's past, piecing together fragments of an old tragedy. She learned about the fire that had destroyed the Blackwell farm, the whispers of a woman named Evelyn, and the unspoken grief that seemed to haunt Amos even from 50 feet above the ground. One day, after nearly a week of camping out, Mia confronted Amos with what she'd uncovered. "The fire, Evelyn, the promise. Is that what this is about?" she asked, craning her neck to see him better. Amos stiffened, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the platform. For the first time, Mia saw something raw flicker in his eyes. A mix of anger, pain, and something close to fear. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut. "And you don't want to." But Mia didn't back down. "Then tell me. Tell me why you've been up here for 20 years. Tell me what you're protecting." Amos's face darkened, and he turned his back to her. "Some things are better left buried," he said quietly. "Go home before you dig too deep." As night fell, Mia realized she wasn't just chasing a story anymore. She was chasing a truth that Amos had spent 2 decades trying to hide. And the closer she got, the more dangerous it felt. Mia's persistence only deepened after her encounter with Amos. She couldn't shake the weight of his words. Some things are better left buried. What was he hiding? Why did he stay? The fire, the promise, and Evelyn? None of it added up. Determined to uncover the truth, she decided to dig deeper, even if it meant venturing into dangerous territory. Mia's first stop was the town archives. Dusty records and faded photographs painted a fragmented picture of Amos's life before the Billboard. The Blackwell farm had been one of the largest in the county, a beacon of stability for the struggling town. But then came the fire. The tragedy had reduced the land to ash, claiming the life of Evelyn Blackwell, Amos's wife. According to the records, Amos had tried to rebuild. For years he'd worked odd jobs and kept to himself. But something changed the day he climbed the Billboard. No one knew what sparked it. Some said it was guilt over the fire. Others whispered about a promise Amos had made to Evelyn on her deathbed. Whatever it was, Amos hadn't set foot on the ground since. The deeper Mia dug, the more unsettling details she uncovered. One newspaper clipping caught her eye. Blackwell tragedy linked to suspicious circumstances, authorities say. The article hinted at arson, but listed no suspects. Who would set fire to the Blackwell farm? And why? One evening, as Mia sat by the base of the Billboard, a rusted truck rumbled up the road. A man she hadn't seen before stepped out. He was broad-shouldered, with a face etched in hard lines and eyes that darted suspiciously toward the towering structure. "You poking around where you shouldn't?" the man growled, his voice low and threatening. "This town don't need people stirring up old ghosts." Mia stood her ground, though her heart raced. "I'm just trying to understand why Amos Blackwell has spent 20 years up there." The man's gaze darkened. "You leave Amos alone. He's up there for a reason, and it ain't for you to know." Before Mia could respond, the man climbed into his truck and sped off, leaving a trail of dust and unease in his wake. Whoever he was, it was clear that Amos's story wasn't just one of personal tragedy. It was tied to something bigger, something the town didn't want her uncovering. The next day, Mia confronted Amos again. "You're not just up here because of Evelyn, are you?" she called up to him. "The fire wasn't an accident. Someone wanted you gone." Amos didn't respond. He sat with his back to her, staring out at the horizon, but Mia noticed his shoulders tense. "I met someone last night," she pressed. "A man who told me to leave you alone. He was scared, Amos, scared of what I might find out." Slowly, Amos turned to face her. For the first time, his voice cracked with emotion. "You don't know what you're walking into," he said. "You think this is about me? About Evelyn? It's not. It's about them." "Who's them?" Mia demanded. Amos sighed deeply, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the platform. "The ones who burned my life to the ground. They thought they'd silence me, but up here, I'm untouchable. As long as I stay, they know I haven't forgotten." Mia's discovery set off a chain reaction. The next morning, her car tires were slashed and an anonymous note was left on her windshield. "Leave Amos alone, or else." It was clear that someone in town didn't want the truth coming out. But instead of scaring her away, the threats only steeled Mia's resolve. She began piecing together clues with the help of a retired firefighter who'd been at the scene of the Blackwell fire. "We always knew it wasn't an accident," the firefighter admitted. But no one had the guts to investigate. Amos wouldn't talk, and the town swept it under the rug. "Why?" Mia asked. The firefighter hesitated. "Because the Blackwells weren't just a family, they were a symbol, and someone wanted that symbol destroyed." That evening, Mia returned to the Billboard with the pieces she'd uncovered. "Amos," she called, holding up the charred remains of an old photograph she'd found at the fire site. It showed Amos and Evelyn standing in front of the farm, their smiles full of hope. "This wasn't just about you, was it? The farm, Evelyn. It was all part of something bigger." Amos stared down at her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with grief. "They wanted the land, Mia. The farm sat on the only viable spot for a development project the town council was pushing. When I refused to sell, they took matters into their own hands. They thought the fire would drive me away. But they underestimated me, and Evelyn." "Why didn't you fight back?" Mia asked. Amos held up the notebook he always carried. "Because Evelyn made me promise to stay. She knew the truth would come out one day. She said I had to wait, no matter how long it took." Mia's chest tightened as the weight of Amos's words sank in. He hadn't just been hiding on the billboard, he'd been standing guard, keeping Evelyn's memory alive and waiting for the day justice could finally be served. Armed with the knowledge Amos had shared, Mia knew she was on the edge of something explosive. The names Amos had scribbled in his notebook, the council members who'd pushed the development project 2 decades ago, were familiar. They were still prominent in the town, wielding influence and wealth. Mia began documenting everything. She took photographs of Amos's notebook, copied the records from the archives, and interviewed the retired firefighter and others who remembered the Blackwell fire. But her efforts didn't go unnoticed. The threats against her escalated. Her hotel room was broken into, and her files were destroyed. Someone was watching her every move. "You don't have to do this," Amos said one night from his perch. He'd been watching her as she pieced together the puzzle. "They'll come after you, just like they came after me." Mia looked up at him, determination blazing in her eyes. "You've been waiting 20 years for justice, Amos. I'm not walking away now." Mia's investigation uncovered a shocking connection. The town's current mayor, Harold Price, had been a junior councilman at the time of the fire. His name appeared in Amos's notebook, alongside notes about zoning disputes and bribes offered to local farmers. Price had everything to gain from the Blackwell farm's destruction. Now, he stood at the pinnacle of the town's leadership, his hands clean, or so he thought. When Mia tried to confront Price at a public town hall, the response was chilling. Price brushed her off with an icy smile. "Ms. Carter, this town doesn't need outsiders digging into the past. Leave the Blackwell matter where it belongs, buried." But the room shifted. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Amos had been a silent figure for so long, a fixture everyone had ignored. But now, people were starting to pay attention. Mia had stirred something in them, an uncomfortable recognition of the truth they had let lie dormant. Mia's fight for the truth reached its breaking point during a violent thunderstorm. Lightning lit up the sky as she pored over her remaining documents in a diner. Suddenly, her phone buzzed with an anonymous tip. "If you want the final piece of the puzzle, check the storage shed by the old council building." Despite the weather, Mia drove to the location. She found the shed padlocked and rusting, but with a crowbar she'd taken from her trunk, she pried it open. Inside, she discovered a cache of old council documents, maps, and financial ledgers. Among them was the smoking gun, proof that the council, including Price, had colluded with a private developer to destroy the Blackwell farm and acquire the land for pennies on the dollar. The fire wasn't just an accident, it had been meticulously planned. Before Mia could leave, headlights flooded the shed. A black SUV screeched to a halt, and 2 men stepped out. "Hand it over!" one of them growled, pointing to the folder in her hands. Mia's heart raced. "You're too late," she bluffed. "I've already made copies." The men hesitated, unsure if she was lying. Seizing the moment, Mia sprinted into the storm, clutching the evidence. She ducked and weaved through the downpour, finally making it back to her car. As she sped away, she realized the men weren't just trying to protect Price. They were willing to kill for him. Mia returned to Amos's billboard, drenched and shaking. "It's all here," she shouted up to him, holding the folder. "Everything. The bribes, the plans, the names. They can't deny it now." For the first time, Amos descended halfway down the billboard ladder, his face illuminated by a crack of lightning. He took the folder from her hands, his expression a mix of sorrow and relief. "Evelyn always said the truth would come out," he murmured. She was right. Mia knew she couldn't keep the evidence to herself. The next morning, she handed it to a trusted journalist from a regional paper. The story exploded. Within days, the mayor and several other officials were under investigation. Townspeople who had long suspected foul play finally had the confirmation they needed, and the quiet guilt that had hung over the town began to lift. The revelations didn't just expose corruption, they changed the town. People who had turned a blind eye to Amos for years now rallied around him. They brought food to the base of the billboard, left messages of apology and support, and asked what they could do to make things right. But Amos remained cautious. "Justice isn't just about the people who did wrong," he told Mia. "It's about making sure it doesn't happen again."